This is a Sports Catastrophe production. Hey there, Heather, ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diamond welcoming you to another Sports Catastrophe on this date. And on this day, November 17th, 1926, the Chicago Blackhawks, as you can see if you're looking at the video portion, the 1926-27 Blackhawks, that was the team. And they played the Toronto St. Pats, soon to be the Maple Leafs, and beat them 5-1, their first ever game in league history. Now you'd be thinking, why am I spending time on the Chicago Blackhawks? Well, they're an interesting team and all that. Now, the history of the NHL up to that point was huge. Back in 1917, when the NHL started out, despite one of the owners by the name of Eddie Livingstone, Toronto was supposed to be with Montreal, Quebec, Ottawa. Well, two Montreal teams, a Quebec team, an Ottawa team, and a Toronto team were supposed to start. Unfortunately, the Quebec team could not get things going by day one of the season, so they folded. And the Montreal Wanderers had their arena burned down, so it was down to three teams: Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, which Toronto was the better team. Quebec came for a few seasons, and then they disappeared and became the Hamilton Tigers. Hamilton had it the NHL for 5 seasons before they were dispersed because of a players' strike, and they were moved to New York to become the New York Americans and all that. The NHL was looking to expand to American markets. I mean, they did with Boston in 1924, bringing it in, and also bring the second Montreal team, the Montreal Maroons, in play. But in 1926 is when the NHL decided to add Chicago and Detroit, for that matter. So what happened was Chicago and Detroit actually were lucky to get good players because they were stocked with players, what they call the Western Hockey League, not the junior league that we know today from where Connor Bedard came from. But the fact of the matter was that that was where the major players were and the Western Hockey League would always challenge the NHL champions for the Stanley Cup, winning it only a couple of times. But the fact of the matter was that they were folding, and the Patrick brothers sold everything. So two teams, Victoria and I think Saskatoon, or was it Portland? I think it was Victoria and Portland. Their players were rearranged to Chicago and Detroit. And so the Blackhawks were full of these Western Hockey League outcasts who would challenge the NHL for the Stanley Cup, but now they were playing in the NHL themselves. Well, the only way to get in is by that way. So anyway, the Chicago Blackhawks started out like beating Toronto 5-1, and it was fantastic. And it was the start of a strenuous franchise history. For one thing, Chicago always called themselves the Black Hawks, as in two words, a two-word thing, because of the infantry that General McLaughlin, who was the first owner of the Hawks, was in. So that's why, and they were always called the Black Hawks with two words. But in 1986, they found out that the infantry was spelled with one word, and Blackhawks was acceptable as one word. So that's why Chicago went back to Blackhawks, just one word. But Chicago was an interesting team. In 1934, they won the Stanley Cup with this great goalie by the name of Charlie Gardner, who was sensational in the net. And the Blackhawks beat Detroit for the Stanley Cup. The only problem was that Charlie Gardner was suffering through a brain hemorrhage because he had not taken a tonsil infection seriously, all that, and it spread to his brain, and he was dead in the off season. But Chicago was a very interesting team. 1938, they even played a lot of American-born players. Back when American-born players were not really that prevalent, not even until like the 70s, did American players get treated that well. But the fact of the matter is that Chicago, well, Major McLaughlin was a patriot and, part of the American infantry. So he hired all these guys. And then Chicago had a problem because their star goalie Mike Caracas was hurt before the 1938 Stanley Cup final against the Leafs. So they had to find this guy by the name of Elfie Bohr in a tavern and put him in net. Hawks won game 1. The Leafs complained. Moore was not allowed to play, and they found Paul Goodman, the minor leaguer. Leafs won. Series tied at 1. No big deal. But the Blackhawks were lucky because Mike Caracas actually had his goalie skates fitted with a mold for his toe that he could play while nursing his broken toe. And the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup that year, even though they were actually below 500. They had to go through a weird playoff scenario, but they did it. They took down the Leafs to win the Cup. Chicago would struggle in the 40s and 50s. They were basically the laughing stock of the league. They had a few good seasons and all that, but they practically were just nothing. That's why I thought that Harry Lumley was actually named the MVP of the 1954 season playing for the Blackhawks, but they were in last place. Chicago struggled mightily, but a massive event with the Detroit Red Wings and the Players Association actually helped out. Because the owners did not like this new NHLPA proposal, they sent their best, those troublemakers to Chicago, who were the worst team in the NHL, so that they were helping Chicago out. In 1961, the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup thanks to many of these guys like Glenn Hall and Ted Lindsay were on the team that were quote-unquote player reps, but they were traded. So the Hawks won the Stanley Cup over Detroit, and, you know, that was good for Chicago. Glenn Hall was in net. He was good. Dan Mikita, Bobby Hall were on that team. Kenny Worm, Pierre Pilote. I think Al Arbor was on that team. But the Blackhawks were decent. In the mid-60s, they were chasing for tops in the NHL. They were the best team in 1967 in the NHL, but the Toronto Maple Leafs beat them in a surprising semifinal upset. Chicago was so angry they traded Phil Esposito, who was a Blackhawk at one time, to Boston for the want of Pitt Martin and Gilles Marat and Jack Norris. So basically, the Bruins were given Phil Esposito, and he gelled with Bobby Orr and made a 1-2 punch in the scoring thing, and Chicago never fully recovered. Brutal mistake, Chicago. But hindsight is 2020. Chicago would do decently. Tony Esposito was picked up in the interleague draft from Montreal, and, you know, he would be the goalie of the 70s for the Hawks. They went to the 71 and 73 Stanley Cup Finals against the Habitants, but lost both times. 71 was that famous Game 7 in which both Canadian networks, CBC and CTV, decided to broadcast the game. And, you know, America got to see that game too. But the Habs, thanks to a lucky goal by Jacques Lemaire. I would say Jacques Lemaire, or was it Andre Richard, who scored from center ice and actually defied logic by scoring past Esposito. Then the Hawks lost in 6 in 1973, despite the fact they won one game, 8-7. So the Hawks were decent, but they just couldn't get past that step. They were the powerful team in the North Division. You know, the North Division had Chicago, Minnesota, St. Louis, Detroit, and Toronto. And it seemed that Chicago was the only consistent ones, as many of the teams just couldn't get anywhere going. But 4 out of 5 teams making the playoffs, you know, Chicago was just dominant and all that. Chicago had a good job in the 1980s. They actually got Denny Savard dropped in their lap in the 1980 draft after Montreal passed on him for Doug Wickenheiser, first overall. Winnipeg picked Morris Lukowich ahead of Dennis Savard, and then Chicago went with Savard, and he was good. Getting people like Al Secord and Ed Olchuk and all them. Decent scorers. Chicago, the Sutter brothers, Murray Bannerman in net, and the infallible Darren Pang was a Blackhawk at one time. Chicago did decent, but then once Ed Belfort, Jeremy Roenick, Steve Larmer, and Dirk Graham were around, the Hawks became decent. By the early 90s, they were perennial favorites to win the Western Conference, to win the Campbell Conference, as it was called, and get to the Stanley Cup Finals. But Edmonton almost always stood in their way. And in 91, the Blackhawks were like the best team in the NHL, but somehow the Minnesota North Stars beat them in the first round in 6 games. I think it was 6. Yeah, in 6 games. Chicago regrouped and went to the Stanley Cup Finals in 92. But unfortunately, despite an 11-game winning streak to get to the finals, they got swept by the Penguins in the Stanley Cup Finals. And Pittsburgh, with that, got to 11 wins themselves, straight wins themselves. Simply put, it just wasn't meant to be. Regardless of that, the Blackhawks in 93 were decent. Unfortunately, they suffered another first-round upset to the St. Louis Blues being swept and Ed Belfour breaking his stick in anger. Why did you come out of the net, Belfour? You would have been safer in the net. But anyway, Chicago in '94 closed down Chicago Stadium, which was one of the original 6 arenas. 65 years in that arena, that was pretty good. The old Chicago Stadium with the organ and, the dominance of the Bulls made it a place to play. They went to the United Center. Blackhawks were decent and all that. They just couldn't get over that hump. Blackhawks had several trips to the Cup final cut short. But in 2010, thanks to a young core of Patrick Kane, Duncan Keith, and Jonathan Toews, among others, the Hawks shocked everyone going to the Stanley Cup Finals and taking care of the Flyers in 6 games thanks to Patrick Kane's overtime winner, which it went in the net, but where was the puck? Who has the puck? But the Hawks broke a 49-year drought, which was amazing. It wasn't the longest drought in NHL history, but it seemed like it. Of course, with that Blackhawks Stanley Cup victory, then the Leafs got the longest Stanley Cup Finals and Cup drought. Something they have had ever since. Ugh. But anyway, yeah, the Blackhawks would prove their fans loyal in 2013 and 2015, winning Stanley Cups as well. So they had 3 cups in the first 6 years of the decade. And everyone thought Chicago was just a trade that wasn't going to stop, but it did. Infighting and scandal has ruined the Blackhawks. They got the #1 pick with Connor Bedard, and he's been doing decent. So what will the future hold for the Blackhawks? Time will tell. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do